They rejected me from the fashion show, then I walked in as the lead designer. The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, its crisp white edges cutting through my dreams like a blade through silk, the words swimming before my eyes as I read them for the 5th time in the dim light of my Brooklyn studio apartment, the coffee growing cold in my trembling hands as reality settled over me like a shroud. Dear Ms. Chen, we regret to inform you that your application for the Meridian Fashion Week has been declined. Your portfolio does not meet our current standards. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Victoria Ashworth, Creative Director. The letter fell from my fingers, floating down to join the scattered sketches and fabric samples that littered my floor, remnants of sleepless nights and desperate hope, 3 years of blood and sweat and tears poured into designs that would never see the light of a runway, never feel the heat of stage lights or hear the whisper of silk against skin as models glided past critics and celebrities. I had dreamed of this moment since I was 7 years old, watching my grandmother's nimble fingers work magic with needle and thread in her tiny shop in Chinatown, her stories of the great designers filling my head with visions of glamour and artistry, of creating beauty that would make people stop and stare and remember, but now those dreams lay crumpled on my apartment floor like discarded paper dolls. Victoria Ashworth, the name tasted bitter on my tongue, the woman who controlled the fashion world of New York City with an iron fist wrapped in designer gloves, whose approval could launch careers and whose rejection could destroy them, and she had looked at my work and found it wanting, ordinary, forgettable. The phone rang, jarring me from my spiral of self-pity, and I almost didn't answer until I saw the caller ID, Emma Rodriguez, my best friend since design school and the only person who believed in my talent even when I had stopped believing in myself. Maya, she said, her voice crackling through the speaker, I heard about Meridian. I'm so sorry honey, but listen to me, this isn't the end, it's just a detour, you're too talented to give up now. I wanted to laugh at her optimism, wanted to tell her that talent meant nothing in a world where connections and money spoke louder than creativity, where dreams went to die in cramped apartments and unpaid internships, but instead I found myself crying, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body as months of stress and rejection poured out of me like water from a broken dam. Emma talked me through the worst of it, reminding me of professors who had praised my work, of small victories and local shows where my designs had been noticed and appreciated, but her words felt hollow against the weight of this latest rejection, the biggest one yet, the one that would have changed everything if only Victoria Ashworth had seen what Emma claimed to see in my sketches. After hanging up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, surrounded by the detritus of my failed career, wondering if it was time to pack it all up and move back home to California, to accept my mother's standing offer to join her real estate business, to trade my dreams of silk and satin for the solid practicality of mortgage payments and commission checks. But something deep inside me, some stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished, whispered that this wasn't over, that Victoria Ashworth might have won this battle but the war was far from finished, and as I stared at the rejection letter lying on my floor, an idea began to form in my mind, dangerous and desperate and absolutely insane. 3 days later, I stood outside the gleaming glass towers of Ashworth Industries, watching well-dressed employees stream in and out of the lobby like fashionable ants, each one carrying the confidence that came with working for the most powerful woman in the industry, and I wondered if I had completely lost my mind. The plan was simple in its audacity. I would get a job at Ashworth Industries, not as a designer but as anything they would hire me for, and I would work my way up from the inside, learning their systems and their secrets until I could prove that Victoria Ashworth had been wrong about me, that my designs deserved to be seen and celebrated. The receptionist barely looked up when I handed her my resume. Emma had helped me craft it to emphasize my business courses and downplay my design background, transforming me from a rejected artist into a qualified administrative assistant with a keen interest in fashion marketing. 2 weeks of interviews and background checks later, I found myself sitting in a gray cubicle on the 15th floor of the Ashworth building, filing paperwork and answering phones for the marketing department, my dreams of runway shows replaced by the mundane reality of expense reports and conference room scheduling. But I was inside, I had a front row seat to the machine that ran the fashion world, and every day I learned something new about how the industry worked, about the complex web of relationships and favors that determined whose designs would be shown and whose would be forgotten, about the careful balance of artistry and commerce that kept the whole system spinning. Victoria Ashworth herself was a ghost in the building, spoken of in hushed tones by employees who had worked there for years but had never actually seen her. She attended meetings in her penthouse office and communicated through a series of assistants and department heads, her presence felt but never seen, like the Wizard of Oz hiding behind his curtain. I threw myself into my work with the dedication of someone with a secret mission, staying late to help with projects that weren't technically my responsibility, volunteering for assignments that would give me access to different departments and different types of information, slowly building a reputation as someone reliable and ambitious. The breakthrough came 6 months after I started, when Sarah Mitchell, the head of marketing, asked me to help coordinate the logistics for the upcoming Meridian Fashion Week. The very show that had rejected me was now partially my responsibility to organize, and the irony was so sharp it took my breath away. I spent weeks working on seating charts and vendor contracts, learning the intimate details of how the show was put together, who the major sponsors were, which designers had been selected and why, and slowly a new plan began to take shape in my mind, bolder and more dangerous than anything I had imagined before. The files I had access to showed me everything: the financial arrangements, the politics behind designer selection, the carefully orchestrated media coverage that would determine which collections would be remembered and which would be forgotten after the lights dimmed, and buried in those files was evidence of something that made my blood run cold. Victoria Ashworth wasn't just the creative director of Meridian Fashion Week, she was actively sabotaging emerging designers, stealing their ideas and passing them to her favored clients, crushing dreams not out of artistic judgment but out of pure greed and power. And suddenly my rejection letter took on a different meaning entirely. The young designer whose collection had been featured prominently in last year's show, Marcus Webb, had submitted designs that were nearly identical to ones I had seen in Victoria's private files, designs that belonged to 3 different rejected applicants who had never known their work was being stolen and repurposed. My hands shook as I printed copies of the evidence, careful to cover my tracks in the computer system, knowing that discovery would mean not just losing my job but potentially facing legal action from Victoria's army of lawyers. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unknow what I now knew about the corruption at the heart of the industry I had dreamed of joining. That night I called Emma, my voice barely above a whisper as I told her what I had discovered, and together we hatched a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, probably both. But it was the only way I could think of to expose Victoria Ashworth and reclaim not just my own stolen designs but the dreams of countless other artists she had crushed under her designer heels. The plan required perfect timing and no small amount of luck, but it also required something else, something I hadn't felt since that rejection letter had arrived. It required hope, the belief that justice could still be served and that sometimes the underdog could win if they were clever enough and brave enough and desperate enough. Emma had connections in the fashion press, photographers, and bloggers who were always hungry for a good story, especially one that involved scandal and corruption at the highest levels of the industry, and she began reaching out to them carefully, planting seeds without revealing the full scope of what we had discovered. Meanwhile, I continued my double life at Ashworth Industries, playing the part of the dedicated employee while secretly gathering more evidence and learning everything I could about the inner workings of the company, each day bringing me closer to the moment when I would have to act or lose my nerve entirely. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using Victoria Ashworth's own system against her, that the access she had unwittingly given me by hiring me was now being turned into a weapon that could destroy everything she had built, and sometimes late at night as I worked alone in the office, I wondered if she would appreciate the poetic justice of it all. 3 weeks before Meridian Fashion Week was scheduled to begin, disaster struck in the form of Marcus Webb's sudden departure from the show. His lead designer position left vacant when he was caught in a scandal involving stolen photographs and blackmail, and the entire fashion world buzzed with speculation about who would replace him. Victoria Ashworth called an emergency meeting of all department heads, her first appearance in the main offices since I had started working there, and I got my first close look at the woman who had rejected my dreams and stolen the dreams of so many others. She was smaller than I had expected, elegant in the way that only comes from years of wealth and privilege, her silver hair perfectly styled and her black dress clearly custom-made, but there was something cold in her eyes, something that spoke of ruthless ambition and the willingness to destroy anyone who stood in her way. The meeting was brief and to the point. Marcus Webb's collection would be scrapped entirely, a new designer would be brought in to create something fresh for the show, and everyone was expected to work overtime to make the impossible timeline work. Failure was not an option, and anyone who couldn't handle the pressure was welcome to find employment elsewhere. As she spoke, Victoria's eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and assessing loyalty, and when her gaze fell on me for just a moment, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if she could see through my carefully constructed facade to the enemy hiding within her own walls. After the meeting, I sat at my desk trying to look busy while my mind raced through possibilities. Marcus Webb's departure had changed everything, created an opportunity one hadn't dared to hope for, and suddenly the plan Emma and I had been developing seemed not just possible but inevitable. That evening I worked until the building was nearly empty, and then I made my way to Victoria's private office on the top floor, my heart pounding as I used the access codes I had memorized from months of careful observation, knowing that if I was caught, my life as I knew it would be over. Victoria's office was a shrine to her own success, walls lined with photographs of herself with celebrities and fashion icons, awards, and accolades displayed like trophies in a hunter's den, but what I was looking for was hidden behind a painting of Coco Chanel, a safe that contained the most sensitive documents in the entire company. The combination had taken me weeks to figure out, pieced together from birthdate and social security numbers I had glimpsed in personnel files, and when the safe finally clicked open, I felt a surge of adrenaline that was equal parts terror and triumph. Inside were contracts and correspondence that confirmed everything I had suspected and more. Victoria Ashworth had been systematically stealing designs for over a decade, building her empire on the broken dreams of artists who had trusted the system to be fair, and the evidence was damning enough to bring down not just her but several major fashion houses that had knowingly participated in the scheme. I photographed everything with trembling hands, knowing that each click of the camera's shutter was another nail in Victoria's coffin, and when I finally closed the safe and slipped out of the office, I felt like I was carrying dynamite in my purse, explosive information that could reshape the entire industry if I had the courage to use it. The next morning brought an announcement that sent shockwaves through the fashion world. Victoria Ashworth herself would be designing the replacement collection for Meridian Fashion Week, coming out of semi-retirement to personally oversee what was being billed as the most important show of the year. I stared at the press release on my computer screen, my blood running cold as I realized what this meant. Victoria wasn't just stealing from unknown designers anymore, she was preparing to steal from me, to take the designs I had submitted and been rejected for and present them as her own masterwork, the ultimate insult added to years of injury. But this time I was ready for her. This time I had evidence and allies, and most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. The scared girl who had cried over a rejection letter was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined, someone who understood that sometimes you had to burn the whole system down to build something better. Emma met me for coffee that afternoon, her eyes bright with excitement as I told her about Victoria's announcement and what it meant for our plan, and together we refined our strategy for the final time, going over every detail until we were both satisfied that we had accounted for every possible contingency. The fashion press had been buzzing with speculation about Victoria's return to design, but they had no idea what story was really about to unfold, that the most powerful woman in fashion was about to be exposed as a fraud and a thief, and that her downfall would come at the hands of one of the very artists she had tried to destroy. 2 weeks before the show, I submitted my resignation from Ashworth Industries, citing a family emergency that required me to return to California immediately, and Victoria's assistant barely looked up from her computer as she processed the paperwork, just another disposable employee leaving the machine that ground up dreams and spit out profits. But I didn't leave New York. Instead I went underground, staying in Emma's apartment and working around the clock to prepare for what would either be the greatest triumph of my career or its spectacular finale. Either way, I was done hiding in the shadows of other people's success. The stolen designs I had discovered in Victoria's files weren't just similar to the ones I had submitted, they were identical, down to the last stitch and seam, my own work staring back at me from her private collection like ghosts of what might have been, and the rage I felt was pure and clean and focused like a laser beam. Emma's contacts in the fashion press were growing more interested by the day, sensing that something big was about to break. But they didn't know the half of it, didn't understand that they were about to witness not just a scandal but a revolution, the moment when the old corrupt system would finally be held accountable. The week of Meridian Fashion Week arrived with all the pomp and circumstance the fashion world could muster, celebrities and influencers descending on New York like beautiful locusts, everyone eager to see Victoria Ashworth's triumphant return to the runway, but they had no idea they were about to witness something far more dramatic. I spent the days leading up to the show making final preparations, checking and double-checking that every piece of evidence was in place, that every journalist had been properly briefed, that the timing would be perfect, because I would only get one chance to destroy Victoria Ashworth and I couldn't afford to miss. The night before the show, I barely slept, my mind racing through everything that could go wrong, all the ways Victoria's money and influence could shield her from the consequences of what she had done, but I had come too far to back down now, had invested too much of myself in this moment of reckoning. On the morning of the show, I put on my best dress, did my hair and makeup with the care of someone preparing for battle, and made my way to the venue where Meridian Fashion Week was being held, a converted warehouse in Chelsea that had been transformed into a temple of high fashion for one glorious week. The backstage area was chaos, models and makeup artists and assistants rushing around in the final hours before the show began, and in the center of it all was Victoria Ashworth, directing traffic like a general commanding an army, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights as she barked orders at anyone within range. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment confusion flickered across her face as she tried to place me, the former employee who had quietly disappeared 2 weeks earlier, and I could see the exact moment when recognition dawned and something cold and dangerous entered her eyes. "Maya Chen," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how unexpected to see you here. I thought you had returned to California for some sort of family emergency. Surely you're not trying to crash my show after the way you left the company." I smiled back at her, matching her tone exactly, and told her that I wouldn't miss this show for the world, that I had been looking forward to seeing her new collection for months, especially the pieces that had been inspired by the work of emerging designers, and I watched her face go pale as she began to understand that I knew far more than a former administrative assistant should. The models were lining up for their final checks, wearing the designs that Victoria would present as her own masterwork, my designs, stolen and rebranded and about to be paraded in front of the most important audience in fashion, but not if I could help it. Victoria stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a whisper as she told me that whatever I thought I knew, whatever game I thought I was playing, I was out of my league, that she had destroyed bigger threats than me without breaking a sweat, that I should leave now while I still could. But I wasn't the frightened girl who had applied to her show 2 years ago. I was someone who had learned how the game was really played, who had gathered evidence and allies and most importantly, who had nothing left to lose, and I told her exactly that as I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with murder in her eyes. The audience was filing into their seats, the cream of New York society mingling with fashion journalists and bloggers, everyone dressed to the nines and ready to witness what they believed would be Victoria Ashworth's crowning achievement, but they were about to see something very different indeed. I took my place in the media section, press credentials that Emma had helped me obtain hanging around my neck like a badge of honor, and around me I could see the faces of the journalists who would help me tell this story, who understood that they were about to witness history in the making. The lights dimmed and the music began, and Victoria Ashworth stepped onto the runway to introduce her collection, her voice carrying perfectly through the sound system as she spoke about inspiration and creativity and the importance of supporting new talent, words that tasted like ash in my mouth knowing how false they were. The first model appeared, wearing a dress that I had sketched in my apartment 2 years ago, had sewn with my own hands during sleepless nights fueled by dreams and coffee, and seeing it walk down Victoria's runway felt like watching my own child being kidnapped, a violation so profound it took my breath away. But I forced myself to wait, to let the show continue as planned while I made final preparations, checking that the live stream was working properly, that the evidence files were ready to be released, that everything was in place for the moment when I would step out of the shadows and reclaim what was mine. One by one the models paraded past, wearing my stolen dreams transformed into Victoria's supposed masterpieces, and with each piece I felt my anger growing stronger and more focused, a white-hot flame that would burn away everything false and corrupt about this moment. The finale was approaching, Victoria's voice rising with excitement as she prepared to present what she called the crown jewel of her collection, a wedding dress that represented 5 years of her design evolution, but I knew better. knew that it represented 5 minutes of my inspiration captured in a sketch that she had stolen from my rejected portfolio. As the final model appeared, the wedding dress flowing behind her like a river of silk and lace, I stood up from my seat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the music, and began walking toward the runway, ignoring the surprised murmurs from the audience as they wondered who I was and what I was doing. Victoria saw me coming and her face went white with rage and fear, but there was nowhere for her to run, no way to stop what was about to happen, and I climbed onto the runway beside her as cameras flashed and the audience fell silent with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone I had taken from Victoria's nerveless fingers, "my name is Maya Chen, and I am the real designer of this collection. Every piece you have seen tonight was stolen from my portfolio by Victoria Ashworth, who has built her career on the broken dreams of artists like me." The audience erupted in shocked whispers and gasps, but I continued speaking, my voice growing stronger with each word as I told them about the evidence I had gathered, the documentation that proved Victoria's systematic theft of designs over more than a decade, the web of corruption that had turned Fashion Week into a showcase for stolen dreams. Victoria tried to grab the microphone back from me, her composure finally cracking as she screamed that I was lying, that I was a delusional former employee seeking revenge, but her words were drowned out by the sound of camera shutters clicking and the murmur of journalists frantically typing on their phones. Emma appeared at the edge of the runway, holding up her own microphone as she began reading from the evidence we had compiled, dates and names and specific instances of design theft that painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond what anyone in the audience had imagined possible. The models had stopped walking, clustering around us in confusion as the carefully choreographed show dissolved into chaos, and in the audience I could see fashion editors and critics pulling out their phones, already composing the stories that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to regain control, lunging toward me with her hands outstretched as if she could physically stop the truth from being told, but security guards were already moving toward the runway, not to protect her but to restrain her, their loyalty shifting as they realized which way the wind was blowing. As Victoria was led away, still screaming denials and threats, I stood alone on the runway in the dress I had worn to what I thought would be her triumph but had become her downfall, and I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, the culmination of 2 years of planning and preparation and desperate hope. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours the fashion press had picked up the story and social media was buzzing with outrage and demands for justice, photos of the evidence Emma and I had compiled spreading across the internet like wildfire, impossible to contain or control. Victoria Ashworth's empire began crumbling immediately, sponsors pulling out of upcoming shows, designers demanding investigations into their own work, law enforcement agencies opening inquiries into fraud and intellectual property theft that would ultimately result in criminal charges. But for me, standing there on that runway as the chaos swirled around me, the most important moment came when a young woman approached from the audience, tears streaming down her face as she told me that she recognized one of the dresses as her own stolen design, that seeing me speak up had given her the courage to come forward with her own story. Over the following days and weeks, more victims emerged, dozens of designers who had been robbed of their creativity and their dreams by Victoria Ashworth's machine, and together we began building something new from the ashes of the old corrupt system, a movement that would change fashion forever. The criminal trial that followed was a media sensation, Victoria Ashworth's fall from grace playing out in courtrooms and newspapers as evidence of her crimes mounted day by day. But for me the real victory had already been won on that runway when I finally spoke the truth that had been burning inside me for 2 years. Emma and I started our own fashion consultancy, dedicated to helping emerging designers navigate the industry without falling prey to the corruption that had nearly destroyed both of our careers, and slowly we began rebuilding not just our own dreams but the dreams of countless others who had been told they weren't good enough. The wedding dress that had been the centerpiece of Victoria's stolen collection became the centerpiece of my first legitimate show 6 months later, finally being seen the way it was meant to be seen, as the work of its true creator rather than the trophy of a thief. Victoria Ashworth was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and intellectual property theft, her fashion empire dismantled and sold off to pay restitution to the designers she had robbed. But the real justice came from the changes her downfall sparked throughout the industry. New regulations were put in place to protect emerging designers, oversight committees were established to investigate claims of design theft, and most importantly, a generation of young artists learned that they didn't have to accept corruption and theft as the price of admission to their dreams. As I stood on the runway for my own Fashion Week debut a year after Victoria's downfall, wearing a dress I had designed in freedom rather than desperation, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The girl who had cried over a rejection letter transformed into a woman who had changed an entire industry. The audience was filled with young designers I had mentored, established artists who had joined our movement, and journalists who had helped tell the story that brought down Victoria Ashworth, and as the applause washed over me, I felt not the bitter satisfaction of revenge but the warm glow of justice finally served. Emma was in the front row, beaming with pride as she watched her best friend claim the recognition that had been denied for so long, and I knew that none of this would have been possible without her friendship and support, without her belief in me when I had stopped believing in myself. The fashion world that emerged from the ashes of Victoria Ashworth's empire was not perfect, no human institution ever could be, but it was fairer and more honest than what had come before, a place where talent could be recognized and rewarded rather than stolen and exploited. Young designers who might have been crushed by the old system now had advocates and protections, ways to fight back against theft and corruption, and most importantly, they had examples of people like me who had refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The rejection letter that had started this entire journey was framed on the wall of my studio now, not as a reminder of pain but as a symbol of transformation, proof that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the catalysts for our greatest triumphs. Victoria Ashworth had tried to steal my dreams, but in the end she had given me something far more valuable, the strength to fight for not just my own dreams but the dreams of every artist who had ever been told they weren't good enough, weren't worthy, weren't welcome in the world they loved. As the lights dimmed on my show and the audience began to file out, still buzzing with excitement over what they had seen, I remained on the runway for a few moments longer, savoring the moment when justice and artistry finally converged, when the truth won out over corruption and theft. The girl who had been rejected from Meridian Fashion Week was gone, replaced by a woman who had not only walked in as the lead designer but had fundamentally changed what that title meant, transforming it from a symbol of stolen success into a badge of honest achievement. And as I finally walked off that runway, surrounded by friends and allies and fellow artists who had helped make this moment possible, I knew that this was not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter of a story that would inspire other dreamers to fight for their place in the world, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. The fashion industry would never be the same after what happened that night when I climbed onto Victoria Ashworth's runway and spoke the truth that changed everything, but then again, neither would I, and that transformation, from victim to victor, from dreamer to revolutionary, was the greatest design I had ever created.